Hello to the curious and the thoughtful. It's Ellie again. Great to see you. Have you noticed that every single story has to have a bad guy in order for it to be a good story? There's always a protagonist or a villain. And without it, the story wouldn't be much. It would go something like, once upon a time, nothing, 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 the end. And people would probably lose interest very, very quickly. Stories are always needed to keep societies running, to feel that deep, resonant emotion when it comes to what's happening around us. Every story needs a villain. Otherwise, nobody would be listening to the stories. We all have stories that tell us how to kind of understand the reality that we live in and what it's all about. But where does the story come from that we end up believing as being part of life's reality? It comes from a storyteller. Did we choose that villain ourselves, or was he or she chosen by the storyteller? And if so, why? Today we're going to be looking at how leaders, the media, and even some social movements are cultivating specially made villains for the purposes of organizing us, the collective. I'm going to show you how to spot when it's happening and also how to sidestep giving the control of your mind to the storyteller. So across all of human history, leaders and storytellers have identified various villains. These are individuals, figures, or groups that we can blame and fear or even rally against. It's not random though. It's a psychological shortcut because creating a villain makes a very complex problem seem very simple to resolve. The villainous face of somebody else, well, that villainous symbol is called the reason for the problem. It gives us someone really simple and easy to identify that we can blame for what might end up being something very, very complex that they're not entirely responsible for. These days, actually, a lot of people are getting really rich by convincing us that there are villains out there and that the villains are the problem. When in fact, the problem is really, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, the problem with today's society is the lack of desire to really knuckle down and roll up your sleeves and fix the increasingly complex problems that are arising here in our reality. It's easier just to point the finger to a villain and say, if this person or that group was no longer around, everything would be okay. It's actually really not true. It's far more complicated than that. And the reason why we know this is because people come and go. Nobody lives forever. And villains die. But have you noticed? They die, but the problem outlives them. And what that means is that the problem is far more complex than just some villain. In fact, with every passing day and every passing year, it becomes more and more complicated and more difficult to solve. Meanwhile, people are still pointing to villains. So this is how villains are cultivated by storytellers. First, they basically have to name a figure from the past or the present, someone who is identifiable to us. And then what they do is they link that memory of this true villain from the past and they link it to the present, to something that's causing anxiety in the current moment. What they do then is they frame it so that it appears as though this brand new entity, something that they've highlighted today, the villain they're pointing to today, is somehow linked to the anxiety that is a memory of the past. And what they do is they frame it as though that new villain is the obstacle that is standing in the way of collective safety or progress in some way. What this does is it creates this perceptive kind of link between the past and the present, the danger and the tragedy from before, and the fact that it could happen again. But it's just putting a brand new face on it, a brand new person. And what this does is it creates unity because it builds this kind of sentiment of fear and outrage that bands people together against their common enemy, which is this villain that has been identified in the current moment. When somebody hands you a villain that you need to be concerned about, what they're doing is they're directing the movie of your life. They're telling you, basically they're giving you a script and they're telling you how to act. They're telling you who to fight, who to fear, and maybe even who to follow in order to get out of this perceived danger. When you are presented with a possible villain, you've got some choices. You can either fall into the trap of believing the villain story without questioning who's going to benefit from that story, or you can raise your awareness. And the way that you do that is by recognizing the pattern. So you could ask yourself, who is telling me this villain story, and what do they gain if I believe them? It kind of is a little thing, but it helps to put everything into perspective. We might have a villain or two in our current culture as well. That remains to be seen, but that doesn't explain how entire groups of people are being named villains. They're being spoken of as being evil, as being villains, as being the bad guys. And I think the reason for that is because media and politics and everything has become so contrived that it's cultivating certain groups, entire groups of people, and calling them villainous or turning them into villainous symbols. And the reason for that is to be able to find someone that can be focused on for fear and outrage. And it's often exaggerated or it's oversimplified because it's designed to organize the people emotionally and to turn them kind of into a harnessed entity that can be directed in certain ways. There's a stark difference between a genuine atrocity and manufactured villainhood. But if you manufacture a villain, and this is really important, this is one of the reasons why I'm raising this today. If you go to all the trouble of oversimplifying a person and the way that they're perceived and projected and turning them into a perceived villain, you may inadvertently end up creating a villain in that person. Because when a person has been artificially constructed to be a villain, they might end up being forced to live out that perception in order to kind of survive. And I think about, for example, in a marriage, for example, when a husband is constantly being accused of cheating, and he's constantly being accused of cheating, and he's constantly being accused of cheating, and the marriage ends up so tense and the trust is gone, and he happens to be in a scenario where, just by chance he's presented with an opportunity to cheat and he's in the right mindset because he feels hurt and betrayed by the lack of trust, he might think to himself, I'm constantly being accused of cheating. It's only a baby step for me to actually cheat. At least that way, I'm living up to the pressure of being this cheater. That's kind of an example. When you're constantly pointing at a person and calling them the villain, where they always have to defend themselves, they always have to fight, the chances of you constructing that villain and turning them into a villain becomes much bigger. You kind of create the energy that you project onto another person. Sometimes these stories that we're being told to believe are just as dangerous as they appear, not because they're pointing to real, genuine, bona fide villains, but because they end up creating the very thing that they've been making us fear. True strength is not about automatically going into fight mode about some person or group that's been labeled a villain by someone else, or some villain that's been handed to us that we've been told we have to believe is that villain. True strength is about seeing the pattern of manipulation that's occurring around us and choosing to think for ourselves, choosing our own path, always being skeptical of the story that we're being told about someone. The book that I wrote, which hand? This hand, Truth Lies in Twilight, The Prophecy. It predicted a time and a space when people would be trained by self-dealing, greedy people to create the very future that they fear. All we have to do in order to stop that prophecy in its tracks is to think for ourselves and to not allow ourselves to be manipulated by finger pointing and innuendo and accusations, and also this kind of superficial analysis of other people. There's far more to the human spirit than just whether a person is all good or all bad. Everybody is complex, and then we throw in their environment and all of the other unknown variables, and that's when you get the real person. We also need to choose our own path and think for ourselves in order to be the best that we can be, to direct our own future. If this episode spoke to you, then there are this hand, no, that hand, plenty more in the playlist just waiting to be watched. Welcome to the new world. This is Ellie Dreams Down Under. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.